Hello, welcome back to another spot of meta-analysis with me, Hazmat Lorcana. With the big DLC events now behind us, we're going to be taking a look ahead to set champs in the coming month. Is it set champs or store champs? Gosh, I hear them called both things. Hey look, maybe they're both correct. And so what I wanted to have a look at today is the kind of decks you're going to be facing, and what I personally think you'll see the most of. And don't forget, if you've watched my videos or I'm appearing in your recommended, then if you could give me a subscribe or even just a like, that would be fantastic. It really helps the channel. But without further ado, let's get into it. Well, if it wasn't obvious, the first thing we're going to be looking at is Ruby Sapphire. This is undoubtedly the deck you will see most of. It's the deck that's performed consistently well, and even though any Ruby Sapphire player will tell you it has a high chance of bricking, it does always seem to turn up. You know, whenever I say Ruby Sapphire, it makes me think of the Pokemon 3rd generation games. Those were my first ever Pokemon games, so it always brings back massive nostalgia. But I digress. What we're looking at now is the deck that won first place at the Birmingham Challenge event. It's a deck I think you'll see a lot of because it's the first deck that people will go to copy, or net deck as it's called. Fang Crossbow I think we'll see more of in Ruby Sapphire decks. It's fantastic in the mirror because most of the Ruby Sapphire decks have 4 copies of Sisu and 4 copies of Maleficent Dragon. These are all dragons, so they get taken out by the banishment of Fang Crossbow. And on top of that, it's basically 2 ice blocks, given its first ability lets you -2 strength off a character. Very useful item, but it's not just useful in the mirror because of course its first ability is going to allow you to -2 strength off of anything. So picture Big Cindy. You take 2 strength off that and all of a sudden she's Medusa food. And it's the same with Tamatoa as well. It's not the greatest revelation, but I think we'll see Hideaway more than Cusco. I think it's mainly because you could use it as a turn 2 alternative ramp method if really necessary, and I mean it is a bit of an emergency option. I wouldn't really want to be using my Hideaway on my own Porpsicle, but sometimes desperate times call for desperate measures. This deck may also encourage the usage of Mufasa in Ruby Sapphire decks, although I would highly discourage it. I really am not a fan of that card. I've yet to see it actually come off. It's usually just removed, mainly in the mirror match because 4 strength is quite easy for Ruby Sapphire to remove. But none of these decks would be what they are without the core of Ruby Sapphire, and that is Sailor's Sisu on Ice. So when you go into games with Ruby Sapphire, this is really the deck I would expect to see. The player may have included 1 or 2 slight differences, some tech cards sprinkled here and there, but the majority will have the same core, and that's exactly what you're looking at here. The second deck that I think you'll see most of is actually quite tricky. I think it's tied between Green Purple and Steelsong, but we'll take a look at Green Purple first. And the reason that I think this difference has occurred is because Steelsong just hasn't had a good showing recently. It tends to get bullied out by Red Blue, whereas Green Purple gives Red Blue a really good game. And so the 2 main Green Purple decks you will see are versions of either Artabaxes, which we're looking at here. This is definitely a more aggressive version of the deck. The other version of the deck, of course, being Ermeister's Toolbox deck. This version of the deck is a lot more mid-range and looks at finding different tools that it needs to combat different decks, with the sheer amount of card draw that it has within it. But either way, both versions of these decks are fantastic at both playing aggressively whilst also being able to control the board. And by control the board, I mean make favourable trades. They really do struggle to target things that aren't exerted, although there are some tools within the deck that exert things, such as Elsa, the 5th Spirit, or Ursula, Sea Witch Queen. Moving on to the deck that I think is tied for second place, and that is Steelsong. And it is without a doubt in my mind that the most popular version of Steelsong that you'll see is Brendan DeCandio's version that we've got here. However, between Steelsong players, there's a lot of discussion on whether they prefer flutes, lanterns, or Daisy Duck. And each version of the deck plays quite differently and has different advantages and disadvantages. The lantern version that we see here is able to rush out a Prince Naveen into singing Whole New World, and then proceed to keep using those lanterns to flood the board. The flutes version will give you a better chance against the horrible matchup that is Ruby Sapphire, since you'll be able to win from hand in the later game, just by playing songs and tooting your flute. And lastly, the Daisy Duck variant is very, very aggressive and aims to win as quick as possible. They don't mind too much about drawing U cards because they're just going to whole new world them away anyway. This deck is exceptionally strong, and against most decks it will give them a very, very hard time. The problem is that against the most popular deck at the moment, which is Ruby Sapphire, it struggles massively, and any Steelsong player will tell you that. So I'm predicting a slight drop in popularity following the DLC events. But the next deck we'll have a look at has actually had a surge in popularity thanks to the DLC events. And that is this Emerald Steel discard list piloted by Zan Syed. But let's just make things clear. I was actually cooking at the start of this set when I posted a video about Green Steel discard and how strong I thought it was. It's nice to see Zan Syed here piloting a similar deck and doing really, really exceptionally well with it. We see one of the most feared cards from last set come back, and that is Diablo, the Devoted Herald. I didn't actually include this card in my version of the deck, and the reason being for that was I thought he got removed really, really easily. And although Zan performed exceptionally with this deck, when I came up against Diablo in the games that I played at the Birmingham DLC, he wasn't on the board for very long at all. He wasn't even on the board for a turn in most cases. The other form of card draw in this deck is of course the Prince John discard package, and you've got 4 copies of Hypnotize, 4 copies of Sudden Chill. We don't talk about Bruno and Anna all triggering that. Not to mention that the Muses can bounce Anna back and forth, but you know about that if you watch my original deck building video. And I think the next most popular deck after that will likely be Ruby Amethyst. There's always Ruby Amethyst players throughout the course of Lorcana's history. They are ever present. Some come and go, but some just stay on Ruby Amethyst. They're some of the most loyal players in the game. And honestly, that's just because it's a solid, consistent deck. It always has been, and from what we've seen so far, it looks like it's always going to be. New versions of Ruby Amethyst really don't add much from set 5. If they do, it's likely going to be Elsa, the 5th spirit. She can rush in and exert a character when she enters the field. She's also evasive, and a 2/5 evasive is quite tricky to get rid of for anything that isn't red. The other set 5 card that they may run is the Library, a gift for Belle, that just allows them to recycle characters that are banished there for new cards. Yes, that's right, more card draw for Ruby Amethyst. Happy days. The core of Ruby Amethyst, that is mainly the bounce package, stays the same throughout most Ruby Amethyst decks. Yes, certain things change in between them, like the 1-drops that they use, or maybe just the counts of Medusa versus Tremaine, but in general, they're all very similar, and most just follow the game plan of look to wipe the board and play Queen's Castles, or Goats. Now, here's a deck you'll definitely see one of at your set champs. Amber Amethyst Hyper Aggro is a classic deck. It's a very brain off, turn everything sideways deck. It's extremely easy to pilot, and you can catch a lot of the more greedy decks off guard. And for that reason, you will see this deck at least once. Now don't get me wrong, it's not going to be popular because it does get stomped by quite a few different decks. Green Steel and Steelsong both do really, really well into it. But that being said, with as many Ruby Sapphire decks as we're going to be seeing, perhaps this deck's actually going to do okay. Some interesting additions to this deck are, of course, the Rapunzel gifted with healing. This didn't used to get run in Hyper Aggro, but is actually really, really good for the card draw that this deck so desperately needs. Speaking of card draw, we have a few copies of the Library in this deck, which just allows you to recycle all of the aggro cards that are inevitably going to be taken out. Badamim Elephants is another interesting addition to the deck. It'll allow you to bounce something in order to save it, but also has the added bonus of being able to transfer damage off of itself onto one of your opponent's characters. And the important thing is that you can do this without having to pay a thing, so you don't lose momentum with your questing. This deck can go scary fast, and don't ever think you're safe if you're around that 16 to 18 lore mark. This deck's very capable of winning from hand within a couple of turns, using things like Goat to gain a lore when it enters the field or leaves the field, or Baloo, who gains 2 lore when he's banished, or maybe even gathering knowledge and wisdom that just straight up gains you 2 lore for playing the card. Yes, this is certainly one for the Ruby Sapphire players to be a little scared of. And the last deck I wanted to mention was the Lemon and Lime discard deck, with this being the version that came 27th at the DLC Birmingham run by Alphos. I believe that this will probably be the most popular version of the deck, but it's very similar to most of the Lemon Lime discard decks that we're seeing anyway. The reason why I'm putting this at the bottom is that it's an extremely good deck, but it's also quite hard to play, or at least play well. well. And so most of the people that gave it a go during this set might have actually just gone off of it, and are unlikely to pick it up specifically for set champs. Still, it's an extremely good deck, and in the right hands is very tricky to play against. So, to round up, my best guess on the most popular decks this set champs is going to be Ruby Sapphire, Emerald Amethyst, Steelsong, Emerald Steel, Ruby Amethyst, Amethyst Emerald, and Lemon Lime. And you know, hey, maybe I'll be wrong, but that's what I think is going to be what you'll see most of in order. And actually, I'm going to take this moment to tell you that I'm going to be doing a spot of casting for my friends over at Illuminotts. And that'll be on the 12th of October, starting at around 10 AM. I'll link Illuminotts' Twitch channel in the description if you want to drop by and say hi. Or, you know, just watch some Lorcana. But other than that, I've been Hazmat, you've been you guys, and I will see you in the next one. Good luck at set champs!